Hello, welcome again. This channel is called Aldsidu. Aldsidu is the Old Saxon word that means old customs or old ways. It is the Old Saxon word that they use to describe their religion, their pre-Christian religion known today as Saxon heathenry. Because Vikings and the Last Kingdom are two very successful and very entertaining TV shows, these TV shows are bringing in a lot of people into heathenry, and therefore we need to respond by discussing how accurate these shows are historically. So for the TV show Vikings, let's start with that one. And the sources are the Saga of Ragnar and the Saga of Ragnar's Sons. Those are two separate sagas. And Saxo Grammaticus, who's the Danish historian. And I have a blog article where I just put my own translation of the Saga of Ragnar and the Saga of Ragnar's Sons up as one kind of continued saga, but they're really two sagas back to back. It's 5 pages in Word or PDF, so this is not a long double saga. Take about 15 minutes to read. So if you want to read this historically, check out www.aldsidu.com/blog. And then scroll down to see the Saga of Ragnar and the Saga of Ragnar's Sons, and you can read my translation of the sagas for free. So let's discuss Vikings, the TV show, fact versus Hollywood. The English people did not call themselves Saxons any more than they called the Danes or any of the Scandinavians Vikings. So this is hard for a lot of people to understand because after the Anglo-Saxon period, the period was labeled the Anglo-Saxon period. Saxons were Saxon peoples who lived in Saxony, which is northern Germany. The Saxons in northern Germany spoke Old Saxon. The Germanic peoples who did migrate to England, which they weren't as many as a lot of people teach, but they spoke Old English, and Old Saxon are two different languages. And you need training in both to read both. So the Old English Beowulf and the Old English rune poem, just because you can read those doesn't mean you can open, say, the Old Saxon Hellion poem and read that, because these are two different languages. England means Angle land. It's named after the Angles, and the Anglo-Frisians were the main settlers of England. The Romans called these people Saxons, and hence you have words like Essex for East Saxony, Sussex for South Saxony, Wessex for West Saxony. The Old Saxon words for these are extremely different. Ost Saxonland for East Saxony, West Saxonland for West Saxony, for example. Very different, two different languages, two different peoples. So England is Anglo-Frisian peoples who moved there, mixing with Romano-British peoples. Now let's discuss some less controversial things. Aslog was the second wife of Ragnar, and Lagertha was the third wife of Ragnar. Lagertha is only mentioned in Saxo Grammaticus. So, the first wife of Ragnar is Dora, and she's in the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. And in Viking Season 1, Episode 1, you have Ragnar telling his son Bjorn the story of how he won Lagertha's hand. But that is really the story of how he won Dora's hand, if you read the sagas. So, again, Lagertha is the third wife. She's not even mentioned in the sagas, the Scandinavian sagas. She's only mentioned in Saxo Grammaticus. So Dora bore Ragnar 2 sons who were killed, and all the sons of Ragnar were very allied to one another. They were loyal to each other. So when Ragnar's 2 oldest children from his first marriage were killed, Aslog's sons rose up and fought to avenge their deaths. These children did not fight one another and kill one another, quite the opposite. They stood up for one another and were very loyal to each other and were loyal sons of Ragnar. And if you were to read the Saga of Ragnar and the Saga of Ragnar's Sons, Aslog is actually a warrior queen in these sagas. So she leads an army and she wins battles, but in the TV show, they show her as one who absolutely wants nothing to do with fighting, nothing to do with war. She is a vulva at best and has no interest in war, but that is not how she's presented in the sagas whatsoever. And I've already mentioned that the sons of Ragnar, they did not kill each other. They were allies. They did not have civil wars. Yes, Viking peoples had civil wars. One village often attacked another village. But the sons of Ragnar did not fight each other historically. Sigurd was not murdered by Ivar, and Ivar did not kill Bjorn in battle. The four sons of Ragnar in the sagas all ended up being kings, and the sons were Ivar the Boneless, who was the oldest, Bjorn Ironside next, Hvitserk, who was called Halfdan in the English sources, is the third. Ubba is not even one of the sons in the sagas. He's only mentioned in a Frisian source. And then, of course, we have Sigurd. So Halfdan or Hvitserk, Sigurd, Bjorn, and Ivar are the four children of Ragnar, according to the Scandinavian sagas. And the historical exploits of Ragnar's sons are hardly given any screen time in the TV show. One great example of this is when the great heathen army shows up to avenge Aelle killing Ragnar. They don't even show that battle. They show him line up, and they pretty much show Aelle saying, "My goodness, this army is way bigger than I prepared for. I didn't imagine it being this big." And they don't even show the battle at all. And they show Bjorn as the leader of that army. He was not the leader of that army. Ivar was. And according to the sagas, Aelle actually drove out Bjorn and Sigurd and Hvitserk. He was not able to drive out Ivar, who used cunning and a hide of an animal to claim York, which I don't think that's a historical part of the saga, but it's a part of the saga. But in the saga, Ivar is the one that Aelle is not able to drive out. Ivar uses cunning to defeat Aelle. Ivar's the one that's able to bring his brothers back, and Ivar's the one who overthrows and performs the Blood Eagle on King Aelle. Ragnar's raids on Paris were very successful. So they're kind of portrayed in the show as failing, that he gives his army over to Floki, and Floki isn't able to overcome. Historically, Ragnar had no problem taking out Paris, and the scene in in Viking season 2, where Ragnar attacks one half of the Mercian army on one side of a river, and then he, beheads them and puts the heads on the ship and then sails over to scare off the other side. That actually happened in Francia, which later became known as France. And there, Ragnar basically saw that they were divided on two sides of the river. He defeated the Frankish army on one side, sailed to a small island in the middle, hung them, didn't behead them, and that scared the army on the other side, and they fled, and then Ragnar sacked Paris. So them showing Ragnar using this to attack Mercia is pretty much putting it in the wrong country. Ragnar invaded Paris in 846 AD. He did not invade Lindisfarne in 793. These raids were over 50 years apart, and the TV show shows that Bjorn was 12 when Lindisfarne is attacked, and maybe twice that age when Paris is sacked. Which is impossible from a historical timing perspective. Ragnar certainly invaded Paris in 846 AD, but he had nothing to do with the attack on Lindisfarne. I already mentioned that Ivar the Great led the heathen army, not Bjorn, and it was Ivar who blood-eagled Aelle. Rollo was not Ragnar's brother. Rollo and Ragnar never met, and they lived 40 years apart. As a matter of fact, Rollo was born in the year that Ragnar was sacking Paris in 846 AD. Viking season 1 shows that, we have an earl saying there are no lands to the west, acting like Norse Scandinavian peoples had no idea that there were islands to the west. That's completely absurd. The Scandinavian peoples were the masters of the sea. The Frankish army, they were the masters of the land. Their cavalry was unmatched in the entire world at the time, but the Norse peoples, the Scandinavian peoples, were unmatched at sea. So, I could have even put on this slide, one thing that really ticked me off with the show was Rollo and Franks are defeating Norsemen in the water in a sea battle. That is absurd. The Norse were the masters of the sea, and that's like showing a Viking shield wall standing up to a Frankish or English cavalry charge. Shield walls do not stand up to cavalry charges, and the Franks and the British people at this time did not have the navies to compete with the Norsemen at sea. They were the masters at sea. End of discussion. Earl Haraldson rules like a feudal lord, and he dominates the thing like, he's a brutal dictator. But things were done outside, not in a mead hall, not in a wine hall. They were done in the open air and led by a law speaker. And Earl Haraldson would not have historically ruled in that way because they did not have the power to dominate the thing in that way. And, there's a lot of people doing many interesting things sexually throughout human history. So there's no need to create adultery that didn't exist historically to create drama. We've got plenty of adultery and plenty of people sleeping with people they shouldn't be sleeping with historically. To invent that for the sake of drama, it kind of drives me crazy. And often Michael Hurst says, hey, I needed to create some drama. So, there's enough drama there. Ragnar had 3 wives, for heaven's sakes. But the sons of the 3 all got along, and no need to create it. And I almost wish I could bring in CinemaSins here because it's doing TV shows now. So if you know the YouTube channel CinemaSins, King Ecbert makes a cuckold out of his son. I tend to wonder how that house would have had so much peace historically. Like, everyone's fine with this behavior, but historically this doesn't work very well. Even the biblical stories of, having multiple wives and children, there's a lot of drama going on. King Ecbert did not historically make a cuckold out of his son. Alfred the Great was not a bastard. The idea of a Viking sleeping with a princess and that causing not a stir and the king actually defending this is absolutely not historical for the time. In this time period, if you committed sin, there's no better place to hide your sin than in the church itself. So if Alfred the Great were a bastard, he would not have been in the history books. He would have been shipped off to a monastery and not taken on pilgrimage to Rome. And I said before, there's no better place to hide sexual sin than the church itself. Charlemagne, the king of Francia, is the greatest example. He conquered almost all of Europe. He had many bastard children. They were all shipped off to monasteries. None of them ruled or had any power. And even the children of Charlemagne, especially the grandchildren, Louis the German, for example, was having nightmares of his grandfather Charlemagne in purgatory, having his genitals gnawed on by demons. The people in this time period within the church, while they did commit plenty of sexual sin, they also had great fear of the consequences spiritually of their sin. That was the culture of the church: fear, repentance, punishment, all that sort of stuff. A princess being put on trial for adultery and losing an ear, having parts of your body chopped off was not a penalty in Christian Europe for adultery. Having the king put his own daughter-in-law on trial and later cuckolding his son and having an affair, an adulterous affair with the woman himself, makes me kind of bang my head, but that's what is portrayed in the TV show. I'm sure you can tell that I think this is more like a soap opera than anything historical. And Alfred the Great would never have been king if he was a bastard. And I understand a lot of people that know English history are going to say, well, William the Conqueror was a bastard. But there is a difference. William the Conqueror conquered England because he couldn't become king in France or Francia. And he used the sword to conquer. So if you're a bastard, maybe you can, through military force, make yourself king. But William's offspring, who inherited his kingdom, they were not bastards either. The Christian people he ruled did not go for that. And I don't think they were jumping up and down that William was a bastard himself, but I think they loved the fact that he conquered England and gave them lands. That's kind of how it works. The seer in Vikings looks more like the Emperor from Star Wars than an actual seer. Historical Scandinavian soothsayers were most of the time women, not that Sathermen didn't exist, but the the three Nornir, or the three fates, to put it in more of a modern term, past, present, and future, they were feminine beings in Norse mythology. So typically the vulvas were women, and they certainly didn't dress like they were out of Star Wars. The people and their haircuts is very odd in the TV show. Scandinavia is very cold, so the idea of cutting your hair off and being almost bald all the time is not how you keep warm, especially since I never see any of the people in the TV show wearing hats. I saw Bjorn dive almost naked into a frozen lake that he was ice fishing in, for goodness sakes, way up in northern Norway. And he comes out and he gets warmed by a fire, which I get, but then he has almost no clothing. He has like one layer of this quasi-leather, fake rubbery clothing that looks like Sons of Anarchy. That's not going to keep one warm in northern Norway. And historical heathen clothing was extremely different than how it's portrayed in both TV shows. You can see Rollo on the left there, wearing some sort of weird black leather pants. I'm not sure if that's a biker outfit or what the hell that is, but that's how Rollo is portrayed. And you can see an outfit based on archaeology where there are leather shoes that are more brown in color because black was outrageously rare. I don't even think black existed. Some sheep were black, but that was really more of a light bluey black at the time, and it didn't stay black for long. It was more navy bluish. But the Norse peoples had all sorts of dyes, and they loved very colorful clothing. They wore linens in the summer and wool in the winter, and they dyed these red, yellow, blue, green, purple. They wore very bright colored clothing, not this brownish, black, leathery, Lord of the Rings, Sons of Anarchy looking clothing, with lots of eye makeup and mascara. Historically, the warriors did all wear helmets. And I get that the TV show doesn't want the characters wearing helmets because they want the audience to see who's fighting who, and it's easier to see that without helmets. But to not have any helmets in the show at all is pretty odd. There was lots of chainmail that was very common for the time. The shields were definitely wooden with rawhide around the edges and multiple layers, and linen, often glued, linen or leather glued to the front so that when an axe banged into the shield, it wouldn't break into pieces. That is typical historical clothing that both TV shows are god awful at. The Uppsala temple looks like a stave church in the mountains, and Uppsala was really very flat. There were some small grave mounds there that looked like small hills. Grave mounds is where the dead were buried, whether they were burned to ashes first or, in a rare case, their bones were buried. The Christians being shown as practicing crucifixion in the Viking period is very odd to me because it was outlawed in the 4th century by the Christian Roman Caesar. It was considered too barbaric for the Christians to even practice. Viking raids is so different from how it's portrayed in the TV show. Viking raids were hit and run. I'm not saying that nuns were never raped. I do believe it was extremely rare. I think the Christian sources were biased. I do strongly believe that, the goal was to get in and get as much treasure and get out back on the ship as quickly as possible. I said before that the Norse were masters of the sea. They were safe on their boats. They weren't going to be caught in their boats. But as soon as you start sacking a monastery, some warning bell's going to go off, and it's only a matter of time before an English army is on your heels. And the goal was to get as much treasure and to get out as fast as possible, kind of like a hit and run type thing. And since the Viking peoples, the Danes, the Northmen, were raiders, they had fortifications because they were a raiding society. So they made sure that they had fortifications to defend their society from being raided. To show a Norse Scandinavian settlement in England with no walls, no towers, no fortifications, no archers, totally defenseless is a very bizarre twist in history. And a Christian genocide of Norse people where the Norse Scandinavian settlements have no protection is just odd. And none is recorded like that in history, so I felt that that was a odd twist that was not very historical in the show. When Ethelred and the orders of Ecgbert wipe out the settlement that was made through Lagertha. Now, the missionary Ansgar was not the failure that Michael Hirst, the creator of Vikings, depicts him as being. According to the historical sources, Ansgar was called the missionary to the north, and he won many converts as the missionary of the north. And in the Christian writings, in the continental Saxon sources, in the writings of Wittikind of Corvey, Ansgar picks up extremely hot piece of metal from a fire that is red. It is so hot, and he's able to hold it and walk without being burned. Now, I don't believe that that is actually historical. I think that's a load of horse, S-H-I-T, but that's how it appears in the writings, not the other way around. I do believe if Ansgar was faced with such a test, he would have failed. I don't think the test is historical, but it is in the historical writings claiming that it happened, and he convinced through this miracle many people in Scandinavia to follow Christ. Doubt it's historical, but it is written the opposite in the historical sources as it's portrayed in the show. Aslog has Ansgar put to death, for example. He was never put to death, this missionary. He was considered very successful, and he died an old man. Pitched battles are very rare. I said before that hit and run was a typical tactic in sacking a monastery. Because in the Middle Ages, a pitched battle, if there is a clear winner, it's kind of like you're risking all in a pitched battle. Negotiation typically happened, and pitched battles were rare. To show the amount of pitched battles that the show shows it makes it like that pitched battles are a completely normal thing. Not saying they didn't happen, but they're more rare than as the TV shows, both of them, portray. Rollo, the estimate lifespan is 846. They believe he was born the year Ragnar was raiding Paris. He died around 932 AD, and that is a huge lifespan for a person of this time period. He besieged Paris in 885 to 886, so 40 years after Ragnar. He was not as successful as Ragnar in terms of defeating them, but he was successful enough to force Charles the Simple to give him a large chunk of land called Normandy, which became Normandy, which, bribing him with land, he becomes a Christian. He now guards the entrance to the Seine River to protect the Christian Paris from Viking raiders. That's really what happened historically. The TV show does show this, but this did not happen contemporary with Ragnar Lothbrok. This was a whole generation later. So what do we know of Ragnar Lothbrok? The Norse sagas identify Ragnar as the father of Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. Ubba is shown as a Frisian in the Frisian sources, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or the Old English Chronicle, shows Hvitserk as Halfdan, but the Scandinavian sources call him Hvitserk. Ragnar was married 3 times to the shield maiden Lagertha, who's his 3rd wife, but Saxo is the only person that records Lagertha, and we're hoping Saxo is not fictional. Some scholars believe Lagertha is fiction, and in that saga by Saxo Grammaticus, Lagertha just murders her husband. She was not a victim of abuse of a tyrant husband, as she's portrayed in the show. The second wife was Aslog, and the first wife was the noblewoman Dora. Ragnar was the son of the Swedish king Sigurd Ring and was the cousin of the Danish king Gudfred. And he distinguished himself with many raids and conquests, including the first siege of Paris in 846 AD. He was later seized by King Aelle of Northumbria and killed by being thrown into a pit of snakes. His sons avenged him by invading England with the great heathen army, and Ivar was the successful one, and it was Ivar who blood-eagled Aelle. In the sagas, Ela drove out the other three children of Ragnar. Ivar is the only son that used military guile to remain, and he's the one that brought the others back. He was the leader of the great heathen army, or at least one of the major ones in the sagas. So let's discuss the Last Kingdom now. Much like Vikings, the clothes are just wrong. All the eyeshadow, the mascara. It's in both TV shows. The English, using rectangular shields, they would have used circular shields just like the Northmen. Backscabbards, I kind of laugh every time I see that. I think they were born in video games. You know, if you're in an army and you're charging and someone in front of you has a backscabbard and they pull their sword out, odds are they're going to strike you in the face while they're drawing their sword. It's hard to draw a sword that way. It's much quicker to draw from the hip as they were historically. And really only the high nobles had swords to begin with. You know, axes did much better against wooden shields. And, you know, the shape of an axe allows you to grab the shield from the top using the axe to pull it down. And the person next to you would use a spear and spear the shield in the shield wall. And shield walls in both shows are totally inaccurate, but I'll get back to that. The Danish horses are shown in the Last Kingdom as having headgear with horns, which makes me laugh because no such horse armor has ever been discovered or attested. The Danes all look like they haven't washed in months in the show, and in reality, you know, Christians and Arabs writing about the Scandinavian people, they all said that they were super clean. So I find it odd that the Christians are portrayed as clean and with well done hair, and the Vikings have, the Northmen have nice long hair, but they're often looked at as very dirty, and none of them seem to get along, and that's their downfall. Like, you know, they don't have any strong central leadership, but to be able to run the Danelaw in England and to conquer large portions of England for 90 years means the Scandinavians had effective leadership to be able to conquer so much land at that period of time without modern weaponry. That shows how organized and how strongly led the Danish or Northmen were. You know, it's harder to find inaccuracies in the Last Kingdom outside of the clothing because, you know, the show is done much better and the books are more historically centered. But the Cornish people in the TV show speak English, and Cornwall, while it's now an entirely English-speaking region, in the 9th century, they all would not have spoken English. They would have spoken the British Cornish language. And English would have been the language of their hated English enemies who had been conquering their land for the better part of 400 years. So Cornishmen would not have spoken to each other in English. They would have spoken their own language to each other. And even in Alfred's time, King Alfred had little control over Cornwall. He did own a few estates there in the northeast, but really Cornwall kind of ruled itself, or the Danes ruled it. In 866, Leeds is a pretty good-sized town, but in the Last Kingdom, it's this tiny little farmstead with like just a handful of houses and fences that wouldn't even hold animals in. Athelflaed in the TV show is rightfully called the Lady of the Mercians, and she did rule the prominent Midland Kingdom of Mercia for 7 years following the death of Ethelred. But there's no real evidence to support the portrayal in the Last Kingdom of Ethelred as being a malicious, abusive psychopath. The historical Ethelflaed and Ethelred were happily married for 40 years and change. They ruled Mercia. The people of Mercia loved them as a couple, and they had a very successful marriage, whereas the Last Kingdom shows them as, you know, one is like a psychopath and them not being happily married at all, which is the opposite of reality. The TV show does show Alfred the Great being very sick, and he was. A lot of people today suggest that Alfred probably had Crohn's disease. You know, I can't speak to that, but he was very sick, and at least the show shows that. The Battle of Edington, the Danes were driven into a fort and then besieged. They did not have an open battle as the show depicts on an open plain. And Guthred did lose. I doubt his conversion to Christianity was sincere. I don't believe he imposed Christian law in Danelaw. That's why it was called Danelaw for one reason. But he was faithful to the defeat of Alfred and the treaty that they signed. He did not attack Alfred again. Wessex remained Wessex and Danelaw remained Danelaw. I do not think Guthred really embraced Christianity. Shield walls in both TV shows are completely wrong. I have a blog on shield walls, so you can visit aldsidu.com/blog and scroll down to the article, Shield Walls of Our Heathen Ancestors. Lindy Beige's YouTube channel gives a great description of historical shield wall, and I kind of borrowed that because it was so well done. Thank you, Lindy Beige. But, a shield wall like that being completely immobile, where you can't see what the enemy is doing, you're going to be flanked and attacked from behind. That shield wall is absolutely not a historical shield wall, nor would it be effective. And spears and axes were the main weapons of most people, especially in a shield wall, because only an axe is going to break a shield, and you're going to use, spears, which is the most common weapon of the day outside of maybe bows and arrows. You're going to use a spear to get around some of the shields and, to go for the feet in the upper section. Because a historical shield wall was just one wall of shields. It wasn't, people from behind and below making 3 layers, 1 layer covering feet, 1 layer the midsection, and 1 layer the upper body. It was really, your first row, they all held their shield and locked them together. But the feet and the heads rough and exposed, which is why they did wear armor in the heads, in particular, helmets and some mail up there, because people weren't foolish and didn't run into battle with no clothes on like they seem to do in Vikings and even the Last Kingdom. I really love the depiction of the Anglian king Edmund being captured and killed by the Danes. It could be accurate. I don't think he was roped to a cross inside the church, but a lot was written of Edmund's martyrdom. And certainly the Christian saint who was arrowed and then clubbed to death is accurate, but I don't think that happened to King Edmund, but that is a hilarious scene in The Last Kingdom. I find both TV shows entertaining, but I think The Last Kingdom is much better done with better acting, much more thought out, has more comedy for sure. So if you're interested in Old Saxon heathenry, visit us at www.aldsidu.com to see my 80-some blog articles, to read the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, to see my shield wall article. Visit www.aldsidu.com/blog and then scroll through the articles. You'll come to my shield wall blog and my translation of the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the saga of his sons completely for free. I do not do Patreon or anything. I want to remain free. My goal is to spread quality education for free. And please like and subscribe because my goal is to put out a good video every week. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.